tell you about how Jules Verne, who wrote a book called The Demon of Contour, usually referred to as the first steampunk novel, writes about a group of British and French engineers that travel across the Gangetic Plains in a steam-powered elephant, like you see here. And he writes quite beautifully about the way in which there's a kind of electric charge that happens across the landscape leading up to the monsoons. He writes quite beautifully and descriptively of the changes in the landscape, but even still he produces, as you can see this map to the right, a very flattened rivers as just lines, cities, towns, barely notated, because again, it's a kind of imperial colonial project in the way that the river basin is drawn. Or say all of the yatra nakshas that I collected, right? These pilgrimage maps that one finds all throughout the Himalayas and the Gangetic Plains, where here we see celestial sites that are imbued with, terrestrial sites that are imbued with celestial significance. So we see all of these mandirs, these incredibly important features of the landscape with respect to Hinduism, but in no way do we see all of the infrastructure that's been put in place to radically transform the river basin, let alone, to talk about the ways in which the story of Ganga's descent, Lord Shiv catches her in his hair, like you see here in this image to the right, which I find a very powerful story in terms of understanding the river basin, again, not as a set of parallel lines of a river channel, but instead thinking of the larger watershed as though it's Shiv's sopping wet hair. And so one of the things that I do is how do you also start to incorporate the incredibly important sacred geography also and sacred spaces that line the river basin, never mind the fact that most of the mandirs and ghats in the city of Haridwar that you see here are actually not along the river channel, but along the Ganges Canal that I'll talk more about in a moment. I think it's important though to also tell you a little bit more about what it is that I don't do. So for instance, in this work, I don't do what, say, the BBC News does, where they lead with Ganges, India's dying mother, and they show a flyover with hazy background. We see the the BBC correspondent having a hard time breathing because of the smell of the nala that's here, right, in terms of the stench that's coming from it, speaking about it in terms of its pollution. It's not because I don't think pollution is important, but it's not precisely what I kind of focus on in my work. It's also why I won't talk about, say, Jugad, kind of, right? We can find all kinds of videos like this one here of how people have developed techniques for doing water filtration themselves, or say the life straw, which development specialists love too, that on one end is non-drinkable water, but through the filtration process of this technological device, you have potable water on the other side. Or for instance, these kinds of technologies like you see here of the solar terracotta water filtration system, where you pour in the water that's not potable, and then through condensation at the bottom actually comes out water that you can in fact drink. It's not that I don't think these technologies are valuable, but I think these technologies produce something much like this image here. Can you all see this image okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So this is a urinal that you can see that's actually in Prayagraj or Allahabad in UP. And it's a urinal that is in no way connected to a larger system. It's meant to be a kind of behavioral change, but if this doesn't get incorporated into a larger system in terms of dealing with wastewater, then this is really effectively doing almost nothing. And so the work that I do kind of flies a middle ground, where if the technologies I shared with you before are primarily kind of a very much on the ground, bottom up in square quotes, and then there's very large top-down projects that I'll share with you, like the Ganges Canal, I try to find a middle ground or a middle scale where the very big and the very small meet. And the drawings that I'll share with you and the techniques that I've developed for imaging this landscape are very much about flying in that kind of middle range. UP, I don't have to tell all of you this. It's always nice to not have to explain this like I do in other parts of the world. But as you know, UP would be the 7th most populous country in the world. It's half the size of California or the same size as Great Britain, yet it produces close to 18% of India's food grains. I think by the next census that should come out, I believe next year, it's probably going to be around 270 million people living in an area that's half the size of California, obviously India's most populous state. So it's an incredible mosaic or patchwork of agriculture and human settlement. So thinking of this as a kind of urban area, it's better to think of it as spreads and densities of agriculture and urbanization and not such distinct city versus town. And as you all probably know, the way in which city is defined or urban in India is when 75% of men working in a locale are employed in the non-agricultural sector. So over 60% of the state is usually rendered rural or agricultural, even though it's incredibly densely populated. So I'll talk a little bit more about how we might also do well to think differently about what constitutes a city when something's so densely populated like this area of the Gangetic Plains. This is a drawing, I believe, from the 1980s of the irrigation works to give you a sense of just the amount of hydrological activity across UP. Here you can see not just only the canals, but also all of the nadis or rivers and certainly some of the larger nalas as well, but not all of them. Ganga Basin, again, as you quite well know, it is the world's most densely populated river basin. When I published the book, I think it was at about 407 million. It's probably well over 500 million today and primarily sits within India, but of course is also within Bangladesh, Nepal, and China. And if I were to say take a plan of the river basin, the larger watershed, and do a kind of exploded axonometric, here you can see that this is the channel of the Ganga here the Jamuna, and then of course the Bay of Bengal. Now, I'll explain a little bit more why I speak about this as a kind of machine. If I then look at, say, the rain-fed agriculture that's in this area, you can see how there's very little of it, especially like in the Ganga, Jamuna, Doab that you see here and throughout much of this. But when I show you the irrigated agriculture, it literally is a kind of continuous supersurface of hydrological activity, of canals, tube wells, etc., within this area. And of course, this is the Indus over here. There's no other part of the world, not even the Indus, that is as hyper-engineered when it comes to water infrastructure as the Ganga Basin. And so it's not just that this system of water that I'm speaking about in terms of canals and tube wells are used for agriculture, it's also what supports so many cities as well. And it's why today, not only is this one of the most densely populated river basins, but drawing up groundwater from tube wells, India is the largest consumer of groundwater in the world, much of that taking place within the Gangetic Plains. Now, when I say Ganges water machine, this is not a term that I came up with or name. It's actually coined by an American by the name of Roger Reve, who taught at Harvard University. He was a demographer and a professor of civil engineering at IIT Kanpur, V. Lakshminarayana. They wrote a paper in 1975 called Ganges Water Machine, where they said that the Ganges River Basin is a kind of water machine in terms of the way that it stores groundwater, and thinking about it almost as a kind of organic machine, as Richard White, an environmental historian, almost would describe it. But in no way in this scientific paper did they show how people live within the environment. There's nothing about the shaping of space. Instead, it's quite a few descriptions, equations on how to better utilize this machine, but in no way shows the kind of dynamic nature of how space changes cyclically with the monsoons and how it's been growing for quite some time in terms of population growth from year to year. And when I say machine, I don't mean something like a chronometer from the 18th century, a kind of mechanical clock that was used to tell longitude. Instead, it's something more like the bionic arm in Luke Skywalker's arm from The Empire Strikes Back. Is it a technology that has a biology, or is it a biology that has a technology? So it's a kind of cyborg that I'm describing here. Again, a kind of organic machine. And the two principal characters, or let's say the extremes of the infrastructural vocabulary of the basin, are on the one hand, canals, which are effectively creating artificial river channels from an existing river, like the Ganges Canal. So they're extremely monumental. They're like highways that you can see from great distances above the earth or above the ground. And on the other hand, the inverse of that is the most clandestine form of drawing up groundwater, which is a tube well, where you literally drill into the ground, attach a pump to the pipe that's been drilled into the ground to draw up groundwater for drinking. And these two are the extremes of the river basin, where one, again, is kind of monumental, and the other is like a straw that's being inserted into the ground to draw up water for drinking and for agriculture. And I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but I assure you I do in the book. But a kind of pocket history of how and why this became a laboratory of the 19th and 20th centuries for water management, or developing a new culture of water management, is worth saying a few words about. So in the late 18th through the early 19th century, the East India Company is moving further and further up the Gangetic Plains from Calcutta or Kolkata. They are mostly being pushed because of Tipu Sultan and the French in the south of India, and they're moving into what were the kind of satrapies and principalities of the Mughal Empire. And they start to notice that as they're moving into these areas, famines keep happening. And these famines, they believe, are not through a kind of change in land tenure rights or through any form of colonialism. It has everything to do with the fact that water is incredibly decentralized, meaning that people get water from wells or from ponds, tals, kunds, etc., and that they're highly dependent upon the monsoons. So the East India Company proposes that the way to thwart monsoons is to build canal systems. Now, the British have a lot of experience with canals for navigation, but almost none for irrigation. So they travel to Italy, they look at the canals that are built there, but the level of water that's coming down in the Po River Valley from the mountains and the amount of sediment is nothing compared to the Himalayas and the Ganga Basin. So they build almost a model at the scale of the territory. They're testing these things out to build a kind of highway for moving water around. And so these are some of the drawings of how they go about trying to transform this landscape. They have to build the longest aqueduct in the world, the Solani Aqueduct that's in Roorkee, that crosses over the Solani River. It's where today IIT Roorkee is located. The first engineering school within British India is set up here to manage this canal system. And it begins in the city of Hardwar, right at just where the Ganga kind of enters the Gangetic Plains from the Siwalik Hills, and originally terminates at the city of Kanpur. So that when it opens, it was 5 times the length of all of the canals in Lombardy, Italy, and Egypt combined. So it's the longest canal system in the world when it opens. And some of the things that have to be done with this system that I'll talk about in just a moment are quite large engineering feats. Today, the canal system has grown to over 12,000 kilometers long. So this is a drawing of the evolution of the Ganga Basin in terms of the Ganges canal within the Ganga Jamuna Doab, that interfluve that you see here, with the Ganges here, or Ganga and the Jamuna River here. Because of the change in topography, they have to build what are called super passages or flyovers so that the river can literally pass over the canal. So all of that sediment and that silt doesn't enter into the canal and really start to clog it. So hopefully you can see in this image here, all of the silt that's being deposited from the Himalayas. This is during the monsoons along the Ganges Canal. And then you see within the river up above, and you see the canal actually passing beneath it. Now, I would say that the monsoons are in many ways the great architects of this landscape. The kind of, again, pocket explanation of the monsoons is that it happens because of a difference in temperature, as you all probably quite well know, between the difference in temperature of the subcontinent and the Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, and larger Indian Ocean. And so that change, that differential in temperature is what produces that tempestuous firewater cocktail that is the monsoons. And it's especially the southwest or summer monsoon that really drenches this area. And I not only look then at the ways in which those vapors that are wafted from the Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea enter the Gangetic Plains and the lower Himalayas, but I also look at the topography of this area. And it's really wonderful to get to share this with architects so that I don't have to kind of explain what section cuts are, but these are 5 section cuts through the subcontinent from the Himalayas all the way into the Arabian Sea here and the Bay of Bengal, so that you get a sense of just the difference in topography that is produced between the Himalayas to the north and, of course, the Gangetic Plains, which are in this uneven bowl. And then you have the Vindhya Hills and the Western Ghats further down. So I not only look at the, say, topography of this area, but then I place that topography in relationship to rainfall patterns. So this is one of those vertical sections that I was showing you before. The red that you see below is the amount of rain that happens. So the deeper the red goes, the more rainfall you have. So I'm literally cutting sections through rain over the course of the year to better understand the differences in rainfall patterns to the geometries and geographies of the basin itself. And it's not just then what we have this incredible amount of rain that comes down, it's between, as I mentioned before, 1 and 1.6 billion tons of silt are shed annually. To give you some sense of that, that's about 3 times the amount of silt that the Mississippi River discharges into the Gulf of Mexico. The Ganga Basin is barely in the top 30 rivers in terms of lengths of the channel. The Mississippi is one of the top 2 or 3, depending upon how you measure the length of a river. And what I mean by that is just not only that this 1.6 billion tons is being shed, but let me make it a little bit more explicit. So in Varanasi, I took these photos back in October of 2005. So the monsoons are over. You can see that it's hazy, but there are really no clouds in the sky. It's not raining. But you can see over the course of 2 days how the water along these ghats goes up and down. And it's not only going up and down. Over the course of these 4 days, you also see the amazing amount of silt that's deposited here. Now, you would think that this was tidal. You'd think that we were on in Mumbai on the coast, but in fact, we're over 600 kilometers from the coast. So that surge of water and sediment is coming, that's just being run off from the Himalayas, that's coming into the river basin over the course of these 4 days. So it really becomes almost like a tidal condition within the area. So understanding that choreography of water, people, and sediment is part of the thickening of the story that I try to tell in the book. And that amount of silt that's been deposited there over the course of 50 million years, over that many monsoons, has created a kind of sponge in terms of the soil. And that allows for the basin to have the greatest amount of groundwater potential in the area, which makes it kind of an ideal place if you want to sink a tube well. So water table levels are naturally very high here because of all of that silt and the monsoons, that the silt becomes that sponge again. So this has been a testing ground for placing tube wells in the area in order to draw up groundwater. So tube wells literally transform groundwater into infrastructure, not just for agriculture, for irrigation, but also, so I'll show you in a little bit, also for cities. This is a photo of a kind of tube well in UP that you can see where we have the pipe coming up, the diesel-powered engine, the pump is down below here, and then we see these rice paddies that are being irrigated by it. So it's really the inverse of the canal system. And if you have the means to sink a tube well, you can sink it almost anywhere in the Gangetic Plains and draw up groundwater if you go deep enough. Some areas are a little bit deeper than others. But in the book, I look at, say, the ways in which you used to find Films Division of India would produce films like this, where we see the lorries coming in to a village that has ox-driven carts, and they're going to sink a tube well, and then the tube well just is a kind of splurge of water. It's this kind of wet dream of development that you have water on demand, that is not part of a canal system and that's not dependent upon rainwater in terms of the rains, but instead treating the land as a kind of water bank. And this, of course, is not only important for drinking and irrigation, but is also extremely important and starts to proliferate during the Green Revolution. And you can see here in this advertisement for Punjab National Bank, we see the Punjabi farmer here, those high-yield variety wheat strains thrown over his right shoulder. We see a tube well here in the foreground. We see DDT being sprayed, and then we see a tractor in the background. So it was also very important as an implement or input for agriculture in India and for many other parts of the world as well. But it's been very understudied in terms of how the tube well has reshaped urban growth and urban form. And of course, you find lots of advertisements like this one from Crompton Greaves that speaks about the amount of water that you're able to produce. And it's again showing a kind of farmer with the water coming out right from the tube well here, and always draws the tube well in section. And the tube well is a little bit deceiving, because if you have a tube well, you can easily think that you can create your own kind of oasis. And it's because it taps into groundwater, which is so out of sight, out of mind for so many people. Yet that is actually all connected in terms of an aquifer. So it's creating a kind of what would be called the tragedy of the commons in some areas, where you actually have water table levels dropping. And you also have, because of climate change, higher incidences of flooding, which is creating more standing water in areas. So you also have wastewater that's starting to infiltrate groundwater. And tube wells were a very preferred method of water for drinking for decades now, because they were not polluted in the same way the surface water body might be. So I started also documenting the ways in which tube wells are so important and integral for so many cities and towns throughout this region, taking lots of photos like this of a tube well that's oftentimes not really out in the open, but is in a building like this, and you hear them more than see them in terms of the diesel-powered engines usually that are being used to draw up groundwater. And of course, all of the hand pumps that one finds all throughout the Gangetic Plains, like here in Kanpur, where we can see water buffalo wallas here. We have a kind of panwala dukans here. It's an incredibly important infrastructure, not just for drinking, but also for bathing, for washing, etc. And so much of the Gangetic Plains and much of India depends upon this extraction of groundwater every day. And I've written about this for various places like the New York Times on the Ganges water crisis with tube wells, and also certainly some of the things I'll share with you I've written about for the Indian Express that I'll talk more about in just a bit. But I think it's helpful to give you a sense of how I started to develop this work and when. So imagine it's 2004. Some of the best books that I could find on the Ganga were, say, Raghubir Singh's photo essays, or this irrigation projects in India kind of avalanche of numbers, madcap adventures like Slowly Down the Ganges or Mapping an Empire, but nothing about the choreography of people, water, agriculture in this area. And so I was very interested in trying to better understand, how do people adapt and incorporate the rhythms of the monsoons in this area? So it's also a moment in time when Google Earth is just going live, very low resolution images of India. So I had very little access to satellite imagery that would actually help me in doing this work. Drones existed, but they were mostly being used by George Bush's administration for spying and assassinating. So I didn't have access to drones to do this work. And even the GRACE satellite system that was launched to measure changes in gravitational pull of the Earth to then map out groundwater resources was so low resolution that it also just wasn't that helpful for the kind of work that I was doing. So I wrote what's called a Fulbright proposal that's sponsored by the US government and Indian government to come to India and develop a dynamic atlas. And what I mean by that is a way of drawing this area that shows how the area changes both chronologically, so how it changes from, say, 1890 to 1895 to 2010, but also cyclically. How does it change every year with the monsoons? So how do you develop drawings that incorporate those changes over time? And so I wrote a Fulbright proposal that say, give me a year and I'll come to India with a Garmin eTrex GPS unit. This is well before the time of smartphones with GPS, and an even clunkier Nikon camera that you see here to document the area. And much to my surprise, I did get the Fulbright. I thought it would take a year to do, but it took a decade to map the river. And when I got to India, I was hoping I would find contemporary maps, but in fact, I found none. Most were at best from the 1970s, and they were usually tracings of maps from the 1960s and 50s. So the basin hadn't been mapped from over half a century. So I had really no choice in 2005 when I arrived, but to really go out and walk the land, to become a barefoot hydrographer, cartographer, and architect. And I'm showing you these images not because of how bad I look with long hair, but because I literally had to go out and walk the land to develop these drawings that I made and make my own instruments to do this work. And so I went all the way from Gangotri Glacier up in the Himalayas, about 4,000 meters above sea level, through the Gangetic Plains, taking about 25,000 photographs, a near kind of continuous panorama of the river basin. The book stops at Varanasi, but the work continued all the way into Bihar and then eventually into West Bengal, and more recently, just prior to the pandemic, into Bangladesh. But the project really required me to do an incredible amount of field work. And one of the places that I was based was this at Allahabad University, Allahabad or Prayagraj that you see here, which is at the very tip of that tongue-shaped interfluve that I showed you before, which is where the Ganges canal system ends today. But this is the Ganga here, this is the Jamuna or Yamuna, and then this is the Triveni Sangam, where for many people are also the Saraswati is. And I was very interested in better understanding why the braiding that you see here happens with the Ganga versus the Jamuna. And a lot of that has to do with the amount of sediment that comes into the riverbed, whereas the Ganga is primarily fed by the Himalayas because of all of the rivers that are also coming down from it, but it blocks the Yamuna River. So most of the water and sediment load that comes into the Yamuna is actually from the Chambal River, which is a very different geological regime. So when you look at this, it might look like it's two rivers, river channels meeting, but it's really two very large geological provinces that are coming together and meeting here. And again, trying to understand the basin as a larger watershed that's not just about the movement of water and people, but also sediment. And so I drew and photographed this area over the course of a year. There certainly were studies that were done by the late Indra Bir Singh, who was a geographer based in Lucknow. These are drawings looking at the very different conditions of where those two sediment regimes come together. But some of the best drawings I could find were, say, these calendar art, like you see here, where we see the celestial and the terrestrial coming together. So we see, say, here, the Triveni Sangam. We have Yamuna or Jamuna, Ganga, Saraswati. We have a South Indian mandir. We have Akbar Kila, a mosque, a church, the railway. All of these layers of the terrestrial and celestial are coming together. So this is a much thicker drawing. And so it became a kind of model for me of how to start to draw the river basin in a different way. And literally when you go to where those two geological provinces or sediment loads meet, you can see the blue waters of the Jamuna and the brown-gray waters of the Ganga. And of course, that is the Sangam. And so you see all of these boats that are queued up here for pilgrims that want to take a holy dip in the river along that line that's constantly changing. And so for me, this is a kind of microcosm of what happens all throughout the basin in terms of it being in a state of flux and not being so static. And so I drew the city both in plan, like using cartography, and I combined that with photography. So this plan that you see to the left here, those tones of violet are how the riverbed expands and contracts both laterally, meaning horizontally, and vertically as well. And those tones of violet, they correspond to certain moments in time as the Earth orbits the sun. So imagine if I take the ellipse of the Earth rotating about the sun and make that ellipse into a straight line and keep the solstices and equinoxes as important moments in time along that line, you can see then that these tones of violet here correspond to the tones of violet that you see there and that you see here. And so it allows me to start to better understand the expansion and contraction of these areas. And so I had to do all of this work by myself. I didn't have a base map. This isn't GIS or satellite tracing. This is me going out and mapping all of this. But so I draw say the river channel in April, May, June, August, September. I then introduce all of the tanks and drains, all of the nalas as well, the settlement patterns that exist here, the roadways, and then I bring all of those back together to make what I think is a much thicker description of how the river and surface water bodies expand and contract. But I also went to the Sangam once every 1 to 2 weeks and photographed at it. And so these are a set of photographs that I took in 2006 in January during Magh Mela, which is a festival where 4 to 5 million people come to bathe at the river. A tent city is built here. Electricity lines are placed, plumbing as well. And so I not only photographed it as a kind of panorama, like you see it up above, but I drew cultivated lands, roads, settlement patterns, people, and a kind of summation, drawing it all together. And then what is quite amazing is that this goes from this city of 4 to 5 million people to then the tent city being pulled up, but the imprint of the city remains on the sandbars and shores of the riverbeds. And so farmers move in and they use those lines for agriculture. They harvest their crops. The monsoons come and wash everything away. And then the following year, the same exact thing happens, but of course the land configuration has changed. This is the most intelligent use of space that I've ever seen in terms of how people incorporate the rhythms of the monsoons to go from hyper dense and urban to bucolic and agriculture in the course of 2 weeks. And then all of that gets washed away. So this is bringing that photography and cartography into conversation so I can capture better the changes that are happening both socially and politically, but of course also spatially as well. And it's been put in things like the Quito Papers and the New Urban Agenda because of the way that I go about drawing these different layers of the city and incorporating environmental uncertainty as opposed to trying to push it away, meaning trying to canalize rivers. And of course, this is where the Kumbh Mela happens. This is a photograph from 2013 of those pontoon bridges. You see the silt here, the electricity lines, and of course, all of the pandals, the 80 to 100 million people that were estimated to pass through this area in 2013 over the course of 45 days, which is of course nothing short of extraordinary. It's inhabited night and day for those number of days. But what I think is more extraordinary than this, which is really quite a feat, is that it literally goes from this to this in 2 weeks' time. The city's pulled up and farmers move in and start growing crops. The water table level is so high because of that sponge of the soil that you don't have to dig even 25 centimeters to hit water so that you can irrigate your crops. We can see here the ways in which the streets that were for the city are now being used for agriculture. And we can still see the tattoo imprints of the tents, their footprints in the sandbars themselves, and of course, a major avenue that's no longer being used as an avenue. So it's literally a drawing at the scale of the landscape itself. And the thing is that if these things are not drawn, these cyclical changes, and then described, how can anybody hope to build on this incredibly intelligent use of space? So part of the task of my work was developing drawings that other people could then use to build upon these rhythms, as opposed to trying to, again, mute them, which is so often the case in other parts of the world. And it's not just a space for bathing and agriculture, it's also a space of recreation and animal husbandry, like you see here, that I think is something to be celebrated and encouraged and embraced within the basin in terms of a kind of mixed use of urban space that happens in this area. Of course, it's also where a lot of the sand mining happens. So much of the concrete that's mixed here comes from the Ganga basin as well. So it's very much tied to the building industry as well. And I don't then only draw the city of Prayagraj in this way, I draw also what are called transects, which are literally ridgeline to shoreline drawings to do a kind of sample survey. The kind of pocket history, again, of a transect is that it's first developed really by Alexander von Humboldt, a Prussian miner. This is a drawing that he produced in South America of Chimborazo, where we see the different ecotones going up in elevation all the way to the snow-capped Andes Mountains and what he called the Avenue of Volcanoes that are here. But we see geology, vegetation, flora and fauna, animal kingdom and vegetal kingdom, along with the mineral kingdoms, all being drawn together. We can see sea level as a kind of datum, and then both drawings and kind of plan and descriptions here. It's a much thicker drawing of describing what we would today call ecotones of this area. And certainly by the middle of the 19th century, people start to use this to better understand both geology, but again, also fauna and flora as well. So understanding the relationships in the earth through section, in terms of geological layers, but also all of the things that are happening on the surface and that have been embedded over time. And then certainly by the late 19th, early 20th century, Patrick Geddes, who was a Scottish biologist who moved to India for some time to do quite a bit of work in the subcontinent, he develops what he calls the valley section from ridgeline to shoreline that builds upon von Humboldt's work and other people in the 19th century to look at the ways in which environment and culture are not necessarily at odds with one another, but instead how they're co-authoring. So say the mining that happens at a higher elevation versus the woodman all the way down to the fisherman. So looking at the kinds of labor and inhabitation, and again, not seeing nature and culture as being as an opposition, but instead, how are they co-authoring space? And by the middle to second half of the 20th century, landscape architects like Ian McHarg are using the transect not only as a means of description of landscapes, but also as a tool for design. And so I use the transect in the Gangetic Plains to draw areas between Allahabad and Varanasi, like you see here. And rather than trying to draw the entire basin, which is quite large, I instead take these samples or these swaths of land that run perpendicular to the river channel, but that are still very long and large to better understand segments of the watershed. So these are 6 of those transects that I drew, doing a kind of survey, and you'll see the tones of violet are very similar to those that I drew for Allahabad. But I draw those 6 transects to better understand the configurations of the river and its drains, certainly the road patterns that exist in those 6 transects, the settlement patterns as well, all of the tanks, tulls, and kunds, the surface water bodies, how they expand and contract. And then I bring also all of the canals, the drains, the nalas as well, so that I can build a much thicker, again, description of this area. My drawings, think of it like this. If usually cartographic drawings are kind of couture, they're like wedding season, apparel in India, right? You wear it just once and it's very much fit to your body at a particular moment in time. My drawings are more like what you find at H&M and Uniqlo, ready to wear, where you gain a few kilos, lose a few kilos, they still fit because they have what you call an apparel design, a seam allowance. So all of these drawings show the expansion and contraction of surface water bodies in relationship also to groundwater and subsequent drawings, so that I get a better sense of how things expand and contract, but also so that the drawings are not outdated before they're even done, as a way of drawing this area. And because I didn't have maps of the area, I also developed my own instruments and prosthetics. So for instance, one of those instruments that I made in order to collect data of the river basin was a surface accumulation sleeve, which is literally a prosthetic that you wear over your right arm, like you see here. You can see that clunky Garmin eTrex GPS unit here. And then I attached packaging tape to my arm so that I could take soil samples of the riverbed, like in much the same way that, say, Spider-Man shoots his web from his wrists. I shoot the packaging tape from my arm a kilometer perpendicular to the river edge, like you see here, so that I can collect soils to do what's called particle size analysis, where the particle sizes of sediment in the soil can tell you a great deal about the behavior of the river over time. So I'm using the kind of packaging tape as a way to do my own form of remote sensing and imaging this landscape because I didn't have any data sets to do it. I've exhibited these kinds of instruments that I made, say, at the Seoul Architecture Biennial with this diorama that you see here, where it's literally, again, something you wear on your arm to do this kind of research that I was mentioning before of this field work to collect soils. These are different iterations of the prosthetics that I designed and one would wear over time, where you can see the packaging tape, the GPS. This is back in the day when I still used a Nokia mobile phone. And it's not just that then these things catch soil, they also collect so many other things like car parts, marigold petals, fecal matter, hair follicles. A colleague of mine, Catherine Hansen, who teaches at the University of Tokyo, when she heard me talk about this, she was like, oh, this is like that game Katamari Damacy, which is about this little prince who's trying to create new galaxies with these orbs that you see here. So this orb is a kind of attractor. So at the beginning of the game, small things start to stick to the orb, like spoons, paper clips, scissors, but it starts to snowball. Jungle gyms start to, playgrounds, and then even entire cities start to collect within it. So an entire world or galaxy gets created. Well, in the work that I do, there's incredible amounts of worlds that start to appear or emerge within those strips of tape, because it's, again, not just soil. It's all of the kind of cultural detritus, human and non-human, that get collected within the riverbed. So it allows me to do a kind of ethnography of the soil. And so then I make also instruments so that I can analyze that in different ways as well, that I won't go into great detail here, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. But I use these technologies to better image this landscape, to work between kind of laboratory or studio and kind of field work or field sites. So moving between these like a sinusoidal wave is very important to the work that I did. And I would scan these rolls of tape, like you see here, to better understand the particle sizes. Now, I didn't have any fancy technologies really to use, so I made a habit of using the wrong thing for the right purpose, where I use Adobe Photoshop's Magic Wand tool. I use it for the right thing, but in the wrong way. So you might use the Magic Wand tool if, say, you want to place a tattoo on someone's chest. But I misuse the Magic Wand tool so that I can actually break down the particle sizes, like you see here, so that I can start to build up a very different understanding of how the riverbed changes over time. So it allows me to build my own kind of data set of remote sensing when you don't have the data to draw upon. So it's a kind of guerrilla tactic for doing this. Now, those rolls of tape get quite big. There's no way that you can bring them to outside of India, because there's a lot of issues with bringing soils. So I also developed another very sophisticated technology called what I call a Ganga dip sock, where I bought 100 pairs of pristine white tube socks and would then thrust them into the river, like you see here, to collect soils, so that I could then have 100 pairs of socks that I could bring back into the US that have the sediment of the Ganga Basin, so that I can start to build up a very different way of mapping and imaging this landscape. So again, it's a kind of example of using the wrong thing for the right purpose to do this kind of work. And then I not only then made, say, using socks and packaging tape, but I also made what I call a surface accumulation rover, where I repurposed a remote control car for a kid. I placed the packaging tape as well as a camera to it so that I wouldn't hurt my back as much when I was having to do the surface accumulation sleeve, the kind of Spider-Man. So this is an image of that rover that I made so that I could collect soil samples as well of the area. But I use all of these instruments to make drawings like this. And it's what allows me to make such large scale drawings of these transects so that I can be in all these different places at the same time, not in real time, but through the sediment that's been dispersed within the area. So I'm working a little bit like a Sherlock Holmes, like it's a kind of sleuthing process where I'm trying to find clues to make connections about the kinds of events that are happening both chronologically, but of course also cyclically as well. And I exhibit these. I've done them at the Nehru Science Center in Mumbai. This was from an exhibition in New Delhi, and you can see these mannequins. These are, I think, a group of students from SPA in Delhi. But this is one of the soiled socks and then the instruments on these mannequins. I try to do exhibitions as a way of broadening the reach of the work that I do, say at the Seoul Architecture Biennial or at the Milan Triennial. A few years ago that Paolo Antonelli was the curator for. But I work across all the way from the scales of soils all the way through kind of cities to those kinds of transects at a kind of larger regional scale. And there's a few reasons for that. I really try to not only work across different scales, but also different mediums as well. So I've written a book about this. I write op-eds about these conditions, and I do exhibitions and workshops as well. And it's because, and I'm sorry, you might be able to hear sirens because I'm in New York City at home, and so it's a little bit loud outside right now, even though it must be past 11 o'clock. It's almost 11:40 at night. But the reason that I wanted to share with you these different mediums is that I think if you can be brilliant at what you do, but if you can't share it with anybody, you're going to lead a very lonely revolution. And so I think it's very important to extend the work that we do as designers and stewards of the built environment to larger audiences. And there's a few reasons for that, but I would say one of them is that more and more of the world is going to face environmental uncertainty, like in the Gangetic Plains. And it's crucial that we as designers use our skills to both read the world around us as well as project it. Otherwise, I would say we are likely to suffer the consequences of sight without the benefits of insight. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anthony, for that beautiful presentation. Let's see whether we have some questions from the audience, from the students. Any questions? Okay, so I think I'll just have a question. Like while you were mapping this these transects, which showed the different conditions of the river during different times of the year, did you also map the human activities, or were there human activities which were engaging with these types of environment? Like as you showed some of the places, you did show agriculture as being one of the activity, but were there many more activities which came in and went out of the system?
Yes. So in the book, I show kind of the photography that I did of these transects as well. So that, for example, there are areas like pre-monsoon where you have pontoon bridges going across, not just at Allahabad, but other areas as well, where you have bazaars that get set up, you have temporary towns that emerge there, there's agriculture happening on its edges. Once the monsoons come, the pontoon bridges are pulled out, and so that area changes. So yes, I document kind of all of those changes that happen there, so that it's not a fix just in cartography, but it also is captured in photographs as well, so that you get a sense of how people inhabit these areas. And I think it's also important because the water table level or groundwater is so also integrated with the riverbed or the river channel as well. And so extending and understanding the connections between groundwater and riverbed were also part of the task of those transects. So also looking at the ways in which the tube wells tie into the aquifers that also connect to the river channel as well. So it's both kind of seeing it in section photographically and in plan.
Like also, were there, like, I just wanted to know, because this is soil, as you said, also very important for the construction industry. So like things like brick kilns or brick manufacturing, maybe units, were they a part of these like terrain? Or because I know that later when you come down to, let's say, the Gangetic Delta, that's where the Sundarbans are, let's say where West Bengal is, I have seen that in these areas, there are a lot of these brick kilns which actually manufacture brick in these areas that you speak of.
Yes, so there's lots of brick kilns all throughout the Gangetic Plains. You find them all throughout UP. I mean, if you drive even from Delhi to Agra, you see so many of them all on that highway. But yes, you find them all throughout UP, Bihar, and of course, there's large numbers of them in West Bengal and Bangladesh. Like I think Dhaka has one of the largest numbers of these in the world in terms of the brick kilns that you see there. So yes, they're everywhere. And then of course, at a certain moment, they exhaust the clay. And so you have just these big pits in the ground, and those become kind of surface water bodies as well in the area. So yes, there's a lot of harvesting of the clay to produce bricks.
Do you have a question from
Sure.
Sorry. My name is Shirish. I have a couple of questions. One is, it seems, I've seen the book several times. It seems like an outrageous project to map the Ganga basin as an individual, with all the kind of pirate techniques and things like that. So what I want to ask you is, what are the kinds of support that you receive from other institutions, people, students? I'm imagining that this is something that will require in future an institutional kind of outreach way to train students to map the landscapes, because this is not something that just stops here. It requires continuous revisiting. So that's one.
Okay, so to answer your question, I mean, I had a Fulbright grant, so that gave me money to live in India to do this work. So I was working on this, most days of the week. I had institutional support in that I was based at Allahabad University in the geography department. So they were kind enough to give me an office and lend me some equipment. Only a handful of times did PhD students come with me to go on some of the boat trips, for instance. But almost all of the work was done by me myself.
Yeah, no, my question is that
Oh.
at any point of time, did you feel that you needed to train students to engage with the you know?
So yes, so I've done workshops in Banaras and also in Allahabad to show people how to do these kinds of techniques as well. I'm currently working on a proposal with the government of India to train a kind of fleet of barefoot hydrographers to do this work as well, so that they can really start to incorporate and develop their own data sets as well to do this work. So yes, but in terms of me continuing it, I mean, in a way that part of the project ended in 2015-16. I still am doing work on the Ganga Basin, but in terms of trying to kind of continue to map it, I haven't continued to map it in this way just because, you know, I'm a professor now and it's a little hard for me to spend so much of my time in India, unfortunately so.
My other question is, we'll be a population of 1.7 billion by 2050, and although the region, particularly the Gangetic Plain, produces large amounts of food, there are going to be or there will be strategic changes required to the landscape of food production. And what are some of those kind of engineering or micro engineering changes that you sense in your work?
Well, I just was in India, in North India, a few weeks ago for a course I teach on the history of the Green Revolution. And so we were mostly in Western UP and Punjab. And of course, Punjab was a major area for exploring kind of what we've come to know as the Green Revolution, like Punjab Agricultural University, which was designed by Aditya Prakash. And there's a lot of work that's being done on how do you grow more food in smaller land areas, because, you know, it used to be that there was a scarcity of water, but there's a growing scarcity of land now as well, because farmers are selling their land for real estate because it's worth more as real estate than as for food. So there are projects underway of trying to change, say, some of the water intensive minimum price points that kind of rates that the government guarantees for rice and wheat, which are so important, but also trying to increase the amount of vegetables that are being produced, because it's realizing that there's a larger issue of nutrition there, fruit, etc. So there's things like this. There's micro irrigation that's coming from, say, drip irrigation, especially from Israel. So there are things that are happening along those lines, but just the amount of food that India is going to need to produce if it wants to remain self-reliant, at least what kind of economists are projecting, will require quite a bit more food to be grown in less and less areas. And that's certainly a huge problem in this area, because also the average farm in a place like Western UP and in UP in general is no more than like 2 acres. You know, it's usually 1.5. So these are very small scale farms. So the amount that you can actually produce from them is quite limited. So there also needs to be changes in the way that cooperatives need to be created or reinstated, so that people just don't sell off their land for real estate, but also continue to develop agriculture. There's also more mechanization, but I mean, as you can imagine too, I mean, agriculture is such a backbreaking job, even with a lot of mechanized tools. So it's not that people who are born into agriculture necessarily want to keep doing it. So I do think the ways in which agriculture is going to need design and engineering, as well as the sciences, is going to become more and more important, and will fall within the space of, I think, architects and landscape architects in the very near future in a place like India. Does that answer your question a little bit? Sorry, I know it's not a short answer.
No, do you think that we have exhausted the hydroengineering potential of the Gangetic Plain already, or?
I think that it's being exacerbated, yes. So, I mean, UP of all the states in India has both the highest incidence of drought and flooding in the entire country. And a lot of that has to do with the inordinate amount of canals and tube wells. Also, just with urban growth or kind of settlement, human settlement growing, you have fewer and fewer permeable surfaces. So when the monsoons happen, there's less and less water that percolates into the aquifer. So that is also creating lots of runoff. It's not so, I mean, it's not creating a lot of problems for topsoil, but it's certainly, there's still a lot more water potential. But one of the problems in the Gangetic Plains, and especially also in like the Punjab area, is that there's flood irrigation. So you're just flooding your farm, your agricultural plots, as opposed to doing something that's maybe more micro that would require less water. So I think there's a lot of policy issues that have to be addressed there, as well as kind of technological and spatial. But I don't think that they've been exhausted, but I don't think you want to exhaust them much more, especially in places like Western UP.
Thanks, Anthony.
Can you come ahead because if they can come into the screen, that'd be better.
Hi, Anthony. It was a really interesting presentation. My question actually comes from this recent work I've been reading. It's called Misreading the Bengal Delta by Camelia Diwan. Essentially, I think she talks about the difference between flooding and inundation, where she talks about like the idea of a good flood. So in Bangladesh, especially, there are like 3 floods. One is called the Borsha, the other is called the Bona, and the third one is called the Jalabadhu. So the Borsha is essentially a good flood that allows for certain kinds of activities, and people construct embankments. Before the colonial forces came in, these were like certain practices that were there that were responding to these 3 kinds of floods with the river itself, meeting the delta. So I was wondering if there were like these kind of terms that you came across, or practices that you came across that do talk about engineering, but not necessarily through the colonial lens of channelizing it, making it a canal. So if you could maybe tell us something about those kind of practices.
Yes. So, for example, I mean, I have photographs of this in the book. You have what are called bundling, which is where you'll use bamboo structures you'll put them in the river channel itself, so that you'll have ground build up along these structures, and then it maintains the channel to be deep enough so that you can move boats through. This is, hundreds of years old. It certainly also predates, the Mughal Empire, right? Which the Mughal Empire comes in through Afghanistan and through the descendants of Genghis Khan. So you do have lots of techniques that predate various forms of colonial and imperial encounters within the area. I think that one of the things, though, that certainly has changed the relationship, and there, Debjani Bhattacharya has written about this extensively with respect to Kolkata, is, for example, the way in which property gets attached to land, so that you want to maintain the kind of geometry of your property so that it doesn't get washed away, or so that it's clear the boundaries, which come very much from kind of the English common law system and other places. So I also think there has to be, that it would behoove us to do better in terms of ways of denoting property that are not so much about ground always being dry. But yes, you certainly see all of the farmers that I was showing you that are doing this work of incorporating the monsoons at the Sangam. I think that's a good example of practices that certainly have been going on for many, many centuries in terms of using the inundation for agriculture. So none of those farmers would describe it as flooding. I mean, they would describe it as doing agriculture.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm sure this is very late in the night for you. Thank you so much for taking out time to show your presentation. It was very enriching, I'm sure, for everyone, and fantastic work that we got to see today. Thank you so much. And yeah, that's it. I think we'll call it a day, and hopefully we'll see you in India sometime.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, for joining us at this hour.
Listen.